At 7:30 hours on October 24, 1944, Commander David McCampbell lowered himself into the cockpit of his F-6F-5 Hellcat on the windswept flight deck of the USS Essex. His eyes tracked a radar operator sprinting toward him, a fresh report clutched in hand, a dispatch that would forever alter the annals of naval aviation. 34 years old, with 25 confirmed kills, the commander of Air Group 15 watched as the man conveyed the stark reality. The Japanese had launched a formidable strike force. 60 fighters and dive bombers were streaming toward the American carrier task force, steaming east of the Philippine archipelago. McCampbell had been in his ready room when the general quarters alarm shattered the morning. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first day. The largest naval engagement in modern history was erupting across 400 miles of Philippine waters, and every available American aircraft was already committed to the sky or being frantically refueled. The USS Essex had 7 Hellcats at readiness, 7 fighters against 60 incoming hostiles. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Standard fighter doctrine demanded a 3-to-1 numerical advantage for defenders. The Japanese possessed nearly 9-to-1 odds in their favor. Air Group 15 had bled heavily in the preceding 3 months of relentless combat operations, losing 11 pilots. McCampbell knew every name. He had penned the letters to their families himself. Lieutenant Morrison was shot down over Formosa. Ensign Caldwell was killed during the strikes on Manila. Lieutenant Commander Harris is missing after the Taiwan raids. Now, the Japanese were hurling their full weight at the American fleet, and the defenders were running perilously short of experienced pilots to counter the onslaught. The Essex stood exposed. Other carriers within Task Group 38.3 had launched their combat air patrols, but these screens were stretched agonizingly thin across 60 miles of open ocean. McCampbell checked his fuel gauge as his plane's captain strapped him into the cockpit. The main tank registered only half full. There was no time to top it off. The enemy formation was a mere 22 miles out and closing at 200 knots. He had perhaps 6 minutes before they entered weapons range of the precious carriers. His Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, and 2,400 rounds in total. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared to life beneath him, unleashing 2,000 horsepower. He scanned the deck. 6 other Hellcats were spinning up, their propellers blurring into circles. Lieutenant Roy Rushing was clambering into the aircraft beside him. Lieutenant Hayes, Lieutenant Johnson, 3 more pilots. Their Hellcats were being pushed into position by the deck crews. 7 against 60. As Air Group Commander, the terrible calculus fell to him. Send all 7 fighters against the entire formation and pray they could disrupt the attack before the bombers reached the carriers? Or split his meager force? The tactical manual was unequivocal. Never divide your fighters when outnumbered. But the manual presumed you possessed more than 7 aircraft. The Japanese formation materialized on the radar plot. 60 contacts. 40 fighters were weaving a loose escort screen around 20 dive bombers. The bombers constituted the mortal threat. A single bomb penetrating the flight deck of the Essex could slaughter hundreds and cripple American air operations for months. Yet the enemy fighters would shred any Hellcat that dared attack the bombers without first clearing them away. McCampbell made his decision in the fleeting seconds it took his plane captain to pull the wheel chocks. He pointed decisively at 5 pilots, then gestured toward the southern quadrant. Attack the bombers. He then locked eyes with Rushing and tapped his own chest. The 2 of them would take on the fighters. 2 Hellcats against 40 Japanese Zeros and Oscars. McCampbell released his brakes and pushed the throttle forward. His Hellcat surged down the deck, lifted into the humid morning air above the Philippine Sea, and began its steep climb. Rushing followed 30 seconds behind. They ascended through 3,000 feet, 6,000, 10,000. The enemy formation was now 15 miles ahead and slightly below. A dark swarm of specks against the vast blue expanse of water. 60 enemy aircraft. 2 American fighters. McCampbell armed his guns and cast a final glance at his fuel gauge. Half tanks. Maybe 90 minutes of flight time if he conserved with extreme care. He nosed the Hellcat over and began his approach, positioning the blinding sun directly at his back. He climbed further, pushing to 20,000 feet. This altitude granted him speed and options, placing physics and gravity on his side. The Japanese formation cruised 12,000 feet below, holding a steady bearing toward the American carriers. Rushing held position 500 yards behind and to the right, the standard two-plane element. They had executed this pattern dozens of times over the Solomons and the Marianas. Leader and wingman. Attack from altitude, use speed to escape. The Japanese fighters flew a loose defensive circle around their bombers. Mostly Mitsubishi A6M0s, fast and preternaturally maneuverable, the finest carrier fighter Japan had ever produced. McCampbell had dueled Zeros before. They could outturn a Hellcat at low speed and climb faster below 14,000 feet. But the Hellcat was a heavier beast, and that weight translated to devastating velocity in a dive. It could outdive anything the Japanese put into the sky. That velocity would become his killing power. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into a 60-degree dive. The airspeed indicator needle swept past 300 knots, then 350, then 400. The enemy formation swelled in his gun sight. He selected his target, a Zero trailing slightly behind the main pack. Always attack the straggler, the weakest link, the one the herd would not miss until it was far too late. He centered the Zero in his reflector sight at 800 yards. 600. 400. The Japanese pilot never looked up. McCampbell pressed the trigger. All 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted. Tracers lanced across the shrinking sky. The Zero's right wing disintegrated. The aircraft rolled inverted and began its final, corkscrewing descent toward the ocean 4 miles below. First kill. 8 more to break the American record. McCampbell hauled back on the stick, pulling up into a brutal climb. For GS pressed him deep into his seat. The Hellcat's wings groaned in protest but held firm. He climbed back to altitude. Rushing was already there. His wingman had mirrored the attack pattern and destroyed another Zero. 2 down. 58 remaining. The Japanese formation dissolved into chaos. Fighters scattered in every direction. Some dove, some clawed for altitude. Their tactical cohesion vanished within 30 seconds. McCampbell picked his second target. Another Zero attempting to climb and meet him. A fatal error by the Japanese pilot. The Hellcat held superior power at this high altitude. McCampbell dove again. Same pattern. Same result. The Zero exploded in a sudden, violent flower of orange flame, burning fuel and ammunition cooking off in a cascade of secondary explosions. No parachute. Second kill. The battle settled into a grim, relentless rhythm. Dive. Fire. Climb. Repeat. McCampbell worked through the Japanese formation like a harvester cutting wheat. A third Zero fell at 0752 hours. A fourth at 0756. Between attacks, he glanced at his fuel gauge. The needle was falling faster than anticipated. All that climbing burned precious fuel. The main tank dipped to 1/4. He switched to the auxiliary tank. Rushing stayed with him through every pass, a steadfast shadow. The wingman fired shorter, more economical bursts. Smart flying. McCampbell's fifth kill came at 0803. A Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar. An Army fighter. The Japanese were now mixing Navy and Army aircraft in the same formation, a testament to desperate measures. The Oscar, with even less armor than a Zero, came apart under his guns like tissue paper. McCampbell lost count of the relentless attacks. Dive, fire, climb. Dive, fire, climb. His shoulders ached from the constant G-forces. Sweat soaked his flight suit despite the frigid air at 20,000 feet. His guns grew hot. He could smell the acrid cordite even through his oxygen mask. A sixth kill. Then a seventh. The Japanese formation had now completely disintegrated. Individual aircraft fled west toward the distant landmass of Luzon. McCampbell checked his ammunition counter. Less than 400 rounds remained. He had started with 2,400. He had burned through 2,000 rounds in 30 minutes of continuous combat. Rushing's Hellcat pulled alongside. The wingman made sharp hand signals, tapping his machine guns, then drawing a slashing motion across his throat. He was out of ammunition, completely dry. All 400 rounds per gun were expended. McCampbell faced another critical decision. Rushing was now defenseless. The prudent move was to escort him back to the Essex. But hostile fighters still prowled the sky. Threats to the American carriers remained. And McCampbell still had ammunition. Not much, but perhaps enough for 2 more attacks. He looked at his wingman and pointed downward toward another cluster of Zeros. Rushing nodded immediately and followed McCampbell into another dive. The wingman understood the tactic. His mere presence would split the attention of the Japanese pilots, forcing them to track 2 threats instead of 1. A Hellcat without ammunition looked identical to a Hellcat with full gun bays. The enemy would not know the difference until it was too late. McCampbell selected his 8th target. Another Zero in a climbing turn. This Japanese pilot was skilled. He saw the Hellcats descending and reversed his turn, driving head-on toward them. A classic Zero tactic. Force the enemy into a turning dogfight where the lighter, more maneuverable aircraft held the supreme advantage. McCampbell had witnessed this before at Coral Sea at Midway during the Marianas Turkey shoot. Japanese pilots revered the head-on merge. He refused the bait. Instead, McCampbell rolled inverted and pulled through. Negative G-forces threw him violently against his straps. Blood rushed to his head, his vision tunneling. He completed the roll and emerged perfectly behind the Zero. A textbook deflection shot. Range, 300 yards. He pressed the trigger. A shorter burst this time, conserving his last rounds. Perhaps 50 rounds in total. The Zero's cockpit shattered. The canopy exploded into a cloud of plexiglass and torn metal. The aircraft snap-rolled left and fell away silently. No fire. Just gravity claiming a dead pilot. 8th kill. 1 more to break the record. 1 more to etch his name into history. McCampbell climbed once more. But his Hellcat felt sluggish, unresponsive. The engine ran rough. The cylinder head temperature gauge crept into the red. He had been at full combat power for 40 minutes straight. The mighty R-2800 was built for toughness, but no engine was designed for such sustained punishment at 20,000 feet in tropical heat. He spotted his 9th target at 0840 hours. A lone Zero fleeing west, running for home. This pilot had seen enough. McCampbell dove for the final time. The Zero pilot saw him and tried to dive away, the worst possible move. A Hellcat could outdive anything in the Japanese arsenal. McCampbell closed to 200 yards. He placed the gunsight pipper on the Zero's engine cowling and fired his last extended burst. The tracers walked up the fuselage. The Zero's engine seized. Thick, black smoke poured from the cowling. The aircraft nosed over into a vertical dive and vanished into an overcast layer at 8,000 feet. 9th kill. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single 90-minute sortie. An American single-mission record. No other Navy pilot in the war would ever match it. For the first time since takeoff, McCampbell keyed his radio. He called the Essex and reported 9 confirmed kills. The radio operator, his voice laced with disbelief, asked him to repeat. McCampbell repeated, his tone flat with exhaustion. 9 confirmed. He checked his fuel gauge, and a cold dread seeped into his veins. The main tank showed empty. The auxiliary tank showed 1/8, perhaps 20 gallons. Maybe 30 minutes of flight time if he throttled back to absolute minimum cruise power. He scanned the horizon for landmarks. The Philippine coastline was visible to the west. Luzon. The Japanese had been chased nearly 100 miles from the American task force. 100 miles back to the Essex. 30 minutes of fuel. The mathematics did not work. He throttled back to bare minimum power, 1800 RPM. The Hellcat shuddered but remained airborne. Rushing pulled alongside again, pointing at his own fuel gauge and shaking his head. Both Hellcats were running on fumes. McCampbell turned east and began the long, desperate glide back toward the fleet. He had to preserve altitude for as long as possible. Height was potential energy, energy he could trade for precious distance when the engines finally quit. Every 1,000 feet of altitude meant roughly 2 miles of glide range. He was at 18,000 feet. Maybe 36 miles of gliding if fortune favored him. The Philippine coast receded behind them. Only open ocean lay ahead. Deep, cold water capable of killing a man in 30 minutes, even if he survived the impact. McCampbell had no intention of testing those statistics. He adjusted his mixture to full lean and watched the fuel gauge. The needle touched empty. The engine coughed once, twice, then smoothed out, running on vapor and sheer will. McCampbell saw the American fleet on the horizon. Tiny gray shapes against the boundless blue, still 60 miles away. The engine coughed again at 50 miles out. His hand moved to the fuel selector. He switched tanks, checked the gauge. Nothing. Both tanks read empty. The Pratt & Whitney was now running on residual fuel in the lines. Vapor and hope. The propeller kept turning, but the engine note changed, growing rougher, missing on cylinders. The Hellcat was dying. Rushing held position 500 yards to his left. His wingman's Hellcat trailed a thin stream of white vapor. Oil temperature climbing. His engine was in worse shape, too many high-power combat maneuvers, too many full-throttle climbs to 20,000 feet. The R-2800 engines were built for the brutal cycle of carrier operations. Launch, fight, land. 90 minutes of continuous combat at maximum power was beyond all design parameters. McCampbell passed through 10,000 feet. The fleet remained 40 miles from Essex. He could now see the carrier task force clearly. For carriers in a box formation, cruisers and destroyers weaving a protective screen around them, their white wakes cutting scars across the dark blue water. He began descending faster, trading altitude for desperately needed distance. 8,000 feet. 7,000. The arithmetic grew tighter with every passing second. At 6,000 feet, the first 5-inch shell exploded 200 yards in front of him. A black puff of smoke from a proximity fuse. American anti-aircraft fire. McCampbell's stomach clenched. The destroyer screen had spotted 2 unidentified aircraft approaching from the west, from the direction of Japanese bases on Luzon. The identification friend or foe transponder in his Hellcat should have signaled his identity, but IFF systems failed. Transponders malfunctioned. Radar operators made tragic mistakes. Another 5-inch shell burst closer, 100 yards out. Then another. The destroyer screen was firing a full barrage. McCampbell shoved the stick forward and dove toward the wave tops. Rushing followed. Both Hellcats plummeted through 3,000 feet in 30 seconds. The 5-inch fire ceased, but McCampbell knew what came next. He had seen it before. Offset plan. The destroyers would now call in the combat air patrol. 4 Hellcats appeared at 2,000 feet, diving toward him. American fighters. VF-19 markings from the USS Lexington. They came in fast in attack formation. McCampbell had no way to identify himself. His radio was fixed on Essex's frequency. He could not switch channels without removing his hands from the controls, and he needed both hands to keep his dying aircraft in the air. The 4 Hellcats closed to 1,000 yards, then 800, then 600. McCampbell could see their gun ports. The lead fighter lined up for a shot. McCampbell broke hard left, pulling for GS. His engine nearly choked from the violent throttle change. The American fighters followed through the turn, trying to force him down toward the water. Standard intercept procedure for an unidentified bogey approaching the fleet. Rushing faced the same peril 500 yards away, for more American fighters on his tail. 8 friendly aircraft were now attempting to shoot down 2 friendly aircraft. McCampbell's engine coughed constantly, running on nothing. He was 3 miles from the Essex, so close he could distinguish aircraft spotted on her flight deck. But the 4 Hellcats behind him closed to 400 yards, then 300. Suddenly, the lead American fighter broke off. McCampbell never learned why. Perhaps the pilot recognized the Air Group 15 markings on his tail. Perhaps someone on Essex had finally radioed the combat air patrol. Perhaps it was simple, blind luck. The other 3 fighters broke away and climbed. Rushing's 4 pursuers followed suit. The friendly fire incident ended as abruptly as it began. McCampbell's engine quit entirely 2 miles from the Essex. Complete power loss. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. He was gliding now. Airspeed, 120 knots. Sink rate, 800 feet per minute. Altitude, 1,000 feet. He performed the calculation instantly. He would impact the water 1 mile short of the carrier. He saw the USS Langley off his right wing, a light carrier CVL-27, smaller than Essex, but her flight deck was clear. McCampbell turned toward the Langley. A dead-stick landing. No power. One chance. The light carrier steamed into the wind, generating a few precious extra knots of airspeed over her deck. Maybe enough. Maybe not. He was at 800 feet altitude and 1 mile out. His sink rate increased. 700 feet. 600. He dropped his landing gear. The hydraulic system, powered by gravity and residual pressure, responded. The gear locked down with a solid thump. He reached for the flap handle but stopped. Flaps would increase drag and steepen his glide. He needed every foot of altitude. Gear down, flaps up. Committed. The Langley grew in his windscreen. He could see the landing signal officer on the port side, yellow paddles in his hands. The LSO gave him the cut signal, too high, too fast, wrong approach angle. McCampbell ignored it. He had no power to adjust, no throttle response. Physics alone flew the airplane now. Gravity, momentum, and the last vestiges of airspeed. 500 feet altitude, half a mile from the ship. He would make it. Barely. The Hellcat crossed the stern of the Langley at 50 feet. The LSO dove into the safety net as McCampbell's landing gear cleared the roundone by mere inches. The Hellcat slammed onto the deck. A crushing, jarring impact. The oleo struts compressed fully. The tail hook caught the number 3 arresting wire. Perfect engagement. The wire stretched, decelerating the 2-ton fighter from 90 knots to 0 in 3 seconds. 8GS slammed him forward against his straps. His head snapped against the headrest. The engine died the instant the tail hook caught, starved of the last vapors of fuel. Deck crew swarmed toward the aircraft to unhook the wire and clear the landing area. But when they tried to release the tail hook, the hydraulic system had no pressure. The engine-driven pump was dead. For sailors had to manually heave and disengage the hook while McCampbell sat in the cockpit, watching his fuel gauge register absolute 0. Rushing landed 30 seconds later. His Hellcat caught the number 2 wire. His engine quit on the rollout. 2 dead Hellcats now sat on Langley's deck. Both pilots alive. Both aircraft battered from combat and hard landings. The deck crew pushed both fighters to the forward parking area for immediate inspection. McCampbell climbed from his cockpit, his legs trembling, nearly buckling beneath him. 90 minutes of continuous, high-G combat followed by an adrenaline crash. A deck officer approached with a clipboard for the standard post-flight debrief. McCampbell recited the numbers in a voice stripped of emotion. 9 confirmed kills. 1 probable. 6 separate attacks on the main formation. Ammunition expended. Fuel expended. The deck officer transcribed it all, then asked McCampbell to wait. An ordnance chief clambered onto the Hellcat to inspect the guns. He opened each ammunition bay, counting the remaining rounds. Port guns. Starboard guns. The chief climbed down and reported. 2 rounds remained. Total. From the 2,400 rounds loaded that morning, McCampbell had fired 2,398. 99.9% of his ammunition. In 3 years of carrier operations, the chief had never witnessed anything like it. The fuel crew checked the tanks. They opened the caps and measured with a calibrated stick. Main tank, bone dry. Auxiliary tank, bone dry. Reserve tank, bone dry. The engine had run on vapor for the final 5 minutes of flight, fuel enough for perhaps 10 more minutes of endurance. Had McCampbell attempted to reach the Essex, he would have plunged into the ocean 3/4 of a mile short of her deck. The deck officer, a veteran of Langley since Guadalcanal, had seen hundreds of pilots return from combat. This was different. McCampbell inquired about the other 5 pilots from Essex, the ones he had dispatched against the Japanese bombers. The officer consulted his status board. All 5 had returned. 2 kills confirmed, 3 probables. No American aircraft lost. The Japanese strike had been utterly broken up before reaching the carriers. No bombs on target. No torpedo hits. Task Group 38.3 had survived intact. McCampbell walked to the island structure and gazed east toward his ship, the Essex, for miles distant. Flight operations continued unabated. Hellcats launched for combat air patrol. The battle raged on around him. October 24, 1944, was merely the first day of the largest naval engagement in history. For separate, titanic battles would unfold across the Philippine waters over the next 72 hours. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle off Cape Engano, the Battle of Samar. More than 200,000 naval personnel would be engulfed. The Imperial Japanese Navy was committing its final strength against the American invasion of Leyte Operation Shogo, the Victory Operation, their last, desperate chance to halt the Allied advance toward the home islands. McCampbell's 9 kills had shattered the morning airstrike against Task Group 38.3, but the Japanese were far from finished. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi commanded the land-based naval air forces on Luzon. He had hundreds of aircraft at his disposal. Zeros, Vals, Kates, Bettys. The morning strike was merely the opening move. 2 more massive waves would launch before sunset, 50 to 60 aircraft per wave. The American carriers would endure relentless assault for 3 days straight. A medical corpsman approached McCampbell on Langley's deck for the standard post-combat examination, pulse, blood pressure, signs of hypoxia or decompression sickness from the high-altitude battle. The corpsman checked his oxygen mask connection, asked about vision problems, headaches, nausea. McCampbell was physically clean, uninjured. The corpsman noted the pilot's hands. They shook violently, adrenaline aftershocks, a normal response after 90 minutes perched on the knife edge of survival. The deck officer handed McCampbell a message from the Essex. Return immediately for debriefing. A destroyer would transfer him back. McCampbell looked toward Rushing. His wingman sat on the wing of his own Hellcat, utterly spent. 6 kills for Rushing. 15 enemy aircraft destroyed between them in one mission. More than most squadrons claimed in an entire month of operations. Rushing was 24, an ensign. This had been his greatest trial. For his performance, he would later receive the Navy Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. McCampbell descended to Langley's hangar deck and proceeded to the boat platform. A whaleboat awaited. The transfer took 20 minutes over rough seas, 3-foot swells, the coxswain timing each approach to Essex's boarding ladder with exquisite care. McCampbell grabbed the lines and climbed 30 feet to the carrier's main deck. An officer met him immediately. The commander of Air Group 15 was required in the intelligence center. Now, the intelligence center, buried deep within Essex's armored hull, was a nexus of controlled frenzy. Maps plastered every bulkhead. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was being tracked in real time. Red markers denoted Japanese fleet movements. Blue markers charted American forces. The Japanese center force under Admiral Takeo Kurita was plowing through the Sibuyan Sea. 5 battleships, including the Leviathans Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers, all steaming for the San Bernardino Strait. If they broke through, they would fall upon the vulnerable American landing beaches at Leyte and slaughter the troops ashore. American carrier aircraft had been attacking the center force all morning. Essex's own dive bombers and torpedo bombers had participated. The battleship Musashi had already absorbed multiple torpedo and bomb hits. She was slowing, listing, but remained afloat, still deadly. The Japanese had constructed her with staggering armor. 16-inch belt armor, 9-inch deck armor. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest battleship ever constructed. McCampbell studied the maps. The tactical situation remained fluid, perilous. The Japanese southern force was approaching from the south through Surigao Strait. 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line lay in wait. 7 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers. That confrontation would erupt after midnight, a classic close-range naval gunfight. Yet the gravest threat emerged from the north. A Japanese northern force of 4 aircraft carriers steamed south from Japan. Admiral William Bull Halsey had taken the fast carrier task force north to intercept them. The bulk of American air power was now moving away from Leyte Gulf, away from the invasion beaches. Kurita's center force might achieve a catastrophic breakthrough if Halsey did not return in time. An intelligence officer briefed McCampbell on afternoon operations. Essex would launch another maximum effort strike against the center force at 1,400 hours. Every available bomber and torpedo plane. McCampbell would lead the fighter escort. His original Hellcat remained on Langley, hydraulics damaged, engine dead. He would fly a replacement. A plane captain was already preparing another Hellcat on the flight deck. McCampbell had 90 minutes to rest, eat, and brief his pilots before the next launch. He proceeded to the ready room. Air Group 15's pilots were already assembling. 23 men. Some had flown the morning combat air patrol. Others had already struck at the Japanese center force in the Cebuan Sea. Lieutenant Commander Richard Rigg Dibbert, who had led the torpedo bomber squadron against Musashi, reported 8 confirmed torpedo hits. The massive battleship was taking on water but remained under power, still doggedly heading for the strait. The pilots now regarded McCampbell with a new, profound respect. Word had electrified the ship. 9 kills in one mission, an American record. They had heard the radio transmissions, seen him and rushing land on Langley with dead engines. Fighter pilots revered victory tallies, but they venerated survival more. Returning from an impossible mission against overwhelming odds earned a currency beyond mere respect. McCampbell had flown combat missions for 7 relentless months, since Essex joined Task Force 58 for strikes on the Marshall Islands in April 1944. Air Group 15 had operated against Truk, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Formosa, and now the Philippines. 6 months of continuous combat, over 20,000 flight hours. The group had destroyed 315 enemy aircraft in the air and 348 on the ground, a tally exceeding any other air group in the Pacific War. McCampbell's personal score stood at 25 kills before this morning. His previous single-day zenith had come during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, the Japanese hurled 400 carrier-based aircraft at the American fleet. McCampbell had destroyed 7 in 2 sorties. 5 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers in the morning, 2 Zeros over Guam in the afternoon. He had become an ace in a day. Now he had achieved 9 kills in 90 minutes. This record would stand unchallenged for the remainder of the war. The closest any Navy pilot would come was Lieutenant Cecil Harris, with 7 over Formosa. McCampbell's 9 kills represented the absolute outer limit of what one pilot, one aircraft, could accomplish under a perfect and terrible confluence. Perfect altitude advantage, a target-rich environment, flawless ammunition conservation, desperate fuel management, and impeccable, ruthless luck. The intelligence officer commenced the afternoon briefing. The Japanese center force continued its eastward push through the Cebuan Sea. Admiral Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Otago, had already been sunk that morning by the submarine USS Darter. Kurita had transferred his flag to the Yamato. That vessel, the largest battleship afloat, mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, each capable of hurling a 3,200-pound shell over 26 miles. A single hit from those behemoths could vaporize a destroyer. Essex would launch 36 aircraft at 1,400 hours, 12 Hellcat fighters, 12 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, 12 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. McCampbell would lead the fighter section. His mission: suppress the withering anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese escort screen while the bombers pressed their attacks against Musashi and Yamato. It was deadly, thankless work. The Japanese battleships alone mounted over 150 anti-aircraft weapons, 25mm machine guns, 40mm Bofors, 5-inch dual-purpose guns. The sky around those ships would solidify into a hellish lattice of flak. McCampbell checked his watch. 1,300 hours. 1 hour until launch. He walked to the flight deck. His replacement Hellcat, aircraft number 47, sat spotted near the island. Different from his regular mount, but mechanically identical. Same R-2800 engine. Same 6.50 caliber guns. Same 400 rounds per gun. The plane captain had completed the pre-flight. Oil checked, fuel tanks brimming, oxygen bottle full, guns loaded and charged. The deck was organized chaos. Aircraft handlers positioned planes for launch. Ordnance crews rolled bombs and torpedoes into place. 500-pound bombs under the Helldivers. Mark 13 torpedoes under the Avengers. Temperamental weapons requiring a drop at precisely 100 feet altitude and 110 knots airspeed. Any deviation meant a futile splash. McCampbell climbed into the cockpit of Aircraft 47. The seat remained warm from that morning's combat air patrol. He went through the familiar ritual. Straps, rudder pedals, oxygen regulator. He had performed this sequence hundreds of times. Yet this afternoon felt profoundly different. 9 kills in the morning. Now, he led men into the teeth of the most heavily defended targets in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The launch order sounded at 13:55. McCampbell's Hellcat rolled down the deck and lifted into the afternoon sky. 11 more fighters followed, then the dive bombers, then the torpedo planes. 36 aircraft formed up over Essex. The strike group turned west, toward the Sibian Sea, toward Musashi and Yamato, toward the densest concentration of anti-aircraft fire the world had ever seen. The afternoon strike proved brutal. McCampbell led his fighters in strafing runs against the destroyer screen, silencing 40mm gun positions, forcing crews to cover while the bombers made their runs. Musashi absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits that afternoon. The colossal battleship finally capsized and sank at 1930 hours, taking nearly 2,300 of her crew with her, the largest warship ever sunk by aircraft. McCampbell landed back aboard Essex at 1,700 hours. 2 more combat missions would follow over the next 2 days as the Battle of Leyte Gulf raged across 400 miles of ocean. When the battle finally ended on October 27, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy lay shattered. It had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 26 major warships totaling over 300,000 tons. The Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Commander David McCampbell flew his final combat mission on November 14, 1944. Air Group 15 soon returned to the United States for rest and refit. McCampbell had flown 212 combat missions. He was credited with 34 confirmed aerial victories and 21 aircraft destroyed on the ground. He stood as the United States Navy's top fighter ace, the ace of aces. He was the only fast carrier task force pilot to receive the Medal of Honor for aerial combat. President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented him with the nation's highest award in January 1945. The citation read that he had destroyed 7 hostile planes during the Battle of the Philippine Sea and 9 planes during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Fighting desperately but with superb skill against overwhelming air power, his actions completely disorganized the enemy group and forced them to abandon their attack before a single aircraft could reach the fleet. David McCampbell survived the war. He remained in the Navy, retiring as a captain in 1964 after 31 years of distinguished service. He lived quietly in Florida, granting occasional interviews, speaking at naval aviation events. He never claimed the mantle of hero, defining himself simply as a pilot who did his duty. He died on June 30, 1996, at the age of 86. He rests today in Arlington National Cemetery. An Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, USS McCampbell, DDG-85, was commissioned in his honor in 2002. The F-6F-5 Hellcat he flew on October 24, 1944, Bureau number 70143, nicknamed Mincy 3, is preserved in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. It is displayed exactly as it appeared that historic morning. Navy blue paint, white stars, 34 Japanese flag kill markings adorning its fuselage, a testament to 2 Hellcats against 60, 9 kills in 90 minutes, 2 rounds of ammunition remaining, an engine that died the moment its wheels touched the deck, an American single-mission record that still stands, unchallenged, 80 years later. Commander David McCampbell demonstrated what one pilot, armed with consummate training, flawless tactics, and transcendent courage, could achieve when the fate of a fleet and the course of history rested upon his wings. If the story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved entire fleets with skill and impossible courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Commander David McCampbell doesn't disappear into silence.